Okay, I'd like to welcome you back for our final panel, and Keunwoo is going to be the moderator. He'll introduce our speakers. I hand it off to you.
Okay, so welcome to the final session titled Surviving Contingency and Crisis. Can you hear me well? Okay, so Surviving Contingency and Crisis, Theological and Ethical Reflections, pretty fancy title. So I'm Keunwoo Kwon, fifth year doctoral candidate at Loyola University Chicago, and your moderator for this final session. Before we begin, I have a quick announcement regarding Q&A. As you know, while listening to the presentation, if you come up with any questions, comments, concerns, please send them directly to me through the chat, not to our panelists, so that I can pass those questions to our panelists after all presentations are done. Since we don't have much time, I'm going to start right now. So our first presenter is Kathleen McNutt. Kathleen is a PhD candidate in theology at Loyola University Chicago and current graduate assistant at the Hanks Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage. She is co-editor of The Challenge of God, Continental Philosophy, and the Catholic Intellectual Heritage. Today, Kathleen will present on current environmental crisis and ecofeminist theology with a particular focus on soteriology. So Kathleen.
Thank you, Keunwoo. Nice to see you. Just a disclaimer before I begin, this paper is a shortening of the first chapter of my dissertation. So if it's frustrating that I raise many questions and don't answer all of them, I apologize. The nature of first chapters, but I hope to spark some thinking on these questions. I'm arguing today that the present ecological crisis raises significant challenges. By the way, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. Raises significant challenges for Christian theologies of salvation, or soteriologies. I will articulate the stakes of the climate crisis and the questions they raise for soteriology. I then describe the relative inadequacies of classical atonement theories for a world in such a crisis. I argue that after the criticisms of classical atonement theory that has taken place over the last half to a century, there's been a dearth of soteriologies to take its place. So first, global climate change. This raises so many pressing problems that it would be impossible to discuss all of them here. Instead, I'm going to briefly summarize the problem of climate change and draw out two facets of it that raise particular soteriological questions for our time. The first of these is massive species loss, and the second is the human impact caused directly or indirectly by climate change. Increasing poverty, mass migrations, refugee crises, and political upheaval, for example, can all be exacerbated by ecological destruction. Global climate change refers to the unprecedented change in the Earth's average temperature. Currently, we are at approximately 1 degree Celsius, caused by the precipitous increase in greenhouse gas emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so about the mid-19th century, and speeding up throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. These gases trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, causing glaciers to melt, sea levels to rise, land to turn to desert, the frequency of severe weather events to increase, among many other major consequences. This climate change is anthropogenic, meaning it is caused by human activity. According to scientists, while human actions already taken will continue to affect the warming of the planet for a long time to come, there are actions humans can take now to prevent it from getting worse. However, the damage is already here and is projected to get much worse without extreme intervention. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I will hereafter abbreviate to the IPCC for brevity, current impacts include increases in both land and ocean temperatures, as well as more frequent heat waves in most land regions. Further, there is substantial evidence that human-induced global warming has led to an increase in the frequency, intensity, and/or amount of heavy precipitation events at the global scale. Earth's oceans have already acidified, leading to losses of species and ecosystems. The IPCC focuses on the need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average, or at most 2 degrees, a goal set by the Paris Agreement. As a reminder, we're already at 1. In order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the world needs to reach net zero carbon emissions globally by 2050. Even with current commitments from signatories to the Paris Agreement, however, the world will reach 3 degrees Celsius increase by the end of the century, so much more needs to be done. Two issues raised by climate change are massive losses of individual species and of biodiversity, and the more direct impacts of climate change on human communities. So first, biodiversity. On average, while rates vary in different regions, about a quarter of species of plants and animals on Earth are threatened, both directly by climate change and by other related factors such as changes in sea and land use. Around 1 million species already face extinction, many within decades, unless action is taken to reduce the intensity of drivers of biodiversity loss. That's a quote from the Global Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And human impact. Because temperatures and sea levels will rise, human communities are vulnerable to negative impacts of climate change, and even more so at 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial average. Millions, and in some cases hundreds of millions more people will be affected by water scarcity, flooding, drought, displacement by rising sea levels, food insecurity, loss of agricultural livelihood, and certain diseases. These changes are projected to increase global poverty and income inequality. Moreover, the changes themselves will most affect those already living in poverty. Climate change, this is a quote, climate change and climate variability worsen existing poverty and exacerbate inequalities, especially for those disadvantaged by gender, age, race, class, caste, indigeneity, and disability, end quote. Why are all of these issues a theological problem? First, biodiversity. The Christian tradition as a whole recognizes the value both of particular creatures and of the diversity of creatures as such. How much value has varied across Christian history, but the Bible and the history of Christian doctrine both present non-human Christian creatures as in some sense important. In one passage of the Summa Theologica, St. Thomas Aquinas writes, quote, because God's goodness could not be adequately represented by any single creature, God produced many and diverse creatures, that what one lacked in representing divine goodness might be supplied by another. More recently, Pope Francis tells us in Laudato Si, because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right, end quote. Secondly, the interrelationship between climate change's impact on non-human creatures and non-human beings, particularly those most vulnerable, makes abundantly clear the interdependence of the Earth community. Christian theology could not proceed as though our environment and our non-human neighbors are merely the stage upon which the drama of salvation plays out. Christian theology claims that the incarnation, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ brings salvation. But theologians have always differed as to the meaning of this central idea and symbol. Even the word salvation, which means healing, is a metaphor. Other metaphors include atonement, justification, redemption. Theology has always been multivocal on the ways in which Christ ushers in new possibilities for human beings that begin to make right what has gone wrong and that unite us further with God. Many critics within and outside of Christianity have criticized theology's tendency to talk about salvation as individualistic, disembodied, and detached from the earth and its other creatures. The classic expression of the ecological critique of Christianity is scientist Lynn White's The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, published in Science in 1967. In it, he wrote famously that, quote, especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. For White, end quote, for White, Christianity's displacement of what he calls, quote, pagan or animistic religions, in which creatures had their own spiritual reality, and there's discussion on the misappropriation of those categories, led to boundless exploitation of nature. Though he blamed Christianity for the attitude that leads to the destruction of nature, he also argues that it is a spiritual problem with a spiritual solution. We must rethink and refeel our nature and destiny. White proposed a spirituality that regards non-human creatures as equal to human beings, and he offered St. Francis, in fact, as, quote, a patron saint for ecologists, end quote. From this 1967 rallying cry, a newly formed eco-theology responded in various ways to White's critique. Many, rightly, qualified his arguments as too broad. Many took up his challenge to articulate new spiritualities that were not so disastrous for the planet. In particular, the idea that salvation is salvation from the world has been critiqued extensively by eco-theologians. Christian soteriology has suffered from what Elizabeth Johnson terms ecological silence, having nothing to say about the relationship between human beings and their environment and fellow creatures. At worst, Christian soteriology, and relatedly its eschatology, have contributed to the problem of climate change. As Catherine Keller observes, it so happens that the neo-fundamentalist fantasy of rapture out of this world, just as the going gets bad, followed by a supernatural new creation, claimed such power in the 1980s. This was precisely the time of the most profligate development of the throwaway consumer culture. We cannot but be suspicious that the construction of salvation as supernatural has helped to cause the very destruction of nature from which the earth now needs saving, end quote. The analog for this moment of the 21st century might be something of a perverted theology of the remnant. Salvation, perhaps more informed by apocalypse movies than by the Old Testament, salvation is envisioned in our culture as being the last one standing to use up scarce resources. There is no hopeful vision for the future, but the very brute strength that allows one to beat one's enemies. What are the classic accounts of salvation, and what, if anything, might they have to say about our ecological crisis? Time prohibits me from enumerating them all here, of course, but arguably the most enduring and influential in Western Christianity, at least, has been the satisfaction model of atonement. Articulated by Anselm of Canterbury in Cur Deus Homo, this model posits that sin is an offense against the honor of God, and that since God is due all the honor, it is impossible for human beings to repay this debt incurred in dishonoring God. Anselm's answer to his question, Cur Deus Homo, why did God become man, or why the God-man, is that incarnation and the obedience of Christ solves this dilemma. It was necessary for a human person to pay the debt of honor owed, but only God could do such a thing. The satisfaction model is a precursor for, but not identical to, the penal substitution model that then became more commonplace in later Protestant theology. The main difference being that in the penal substitution model, Christ's death is seen more as a punishment rather than an act of obedience and satisfaction. And there's much discussion on the differences between these two and how much we conflate them. Critics of the substitution model of atonement raise the objection that Anselm's primary metaphor is a juridical or forensic framework. Christ having paid the debt of honor, we are declared righteous before God. The influence of this model means that little interest, as Vegan Garoyan remarks, is given to, quote, the deep ontological repair actually needed for our weakened humanity to be transformed into a true state of holiness and righteousness. This aspect of soteriology was present in older writings on salvation, like those of Irenaeus and Athanasius. This point is also made by Gustav Aulén in his Christus Victor, in which he makes the case for the, quote, classic or Christus Victor model of atonement, in which Christ conquers sin and death, an older metaphor used in patristic texts, and at least so he argues also then in the works of Martin Luther. Elizabeth Johnson, in critiquing the satisfaction model, notes also that healing is a more appropriate way of looking at salvation than is the restoration of a merely legal relationship. Quote, if Jesus fed, healed, soothed, and otherwise cared about persons precisely as embodied, and if his resurrection affirms the body's participation in the shalom of the reign of God, then salvation concerns not just the soul, but also the body, not just the individual, but also society, not just humanity, but also the whole of nature. Indeed, salvation refers not only to the eschatological reality of heaven, but also to this world, end quote. With these critiques in mind, we can see how the notion of Christ paying the penalty for sin with his obedience and death has little to say about salvation as healing the wounded creation that we are so inextricably a part of. Other critiques of the satisfaction model come from liberation theologies of many kinds. In liberation theology, salvation must be at least liberation from oppression. What the climate crisis has revealed about human sin underscores points already made by liberation theologians of many stripes, that many varieties of sin are structural, and moreover, that there is an asymmetry between the sins of oppressors and the consequences of these sins, which fall largely on the oppressed. For example, while the wealthiest countries in the world cause the most pollution and ecological harm, the poorest countries, and the poorest within those wealthy countries, suffer from it. Liberationist thinkers also question the valorization of suffering that traditional soteriology often upholds. These critiques range from the assertion of feminists Rebecca Parker and Joanne Carlson Brown that the penal substitution model in particular amounts to, quote, divine child abuse, end quote, and to the pronouncement of John Sobrino that our task as Christians is, quote, to take the crucified off the cross. And so a different understanding of salvation needs to take hold within Christianity that takes into account the serious moral, spiritual, and physical threat of climate change. As Pope Francis recently tweeted a few months ago, quote, we need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are all saved. We are either all saved together or no one is saved. Poverty, decadence, and suffering in one part of the earth are a breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the entire planet. Hashtag Fratelli Tutti, hashtag end poverty. This was in October. You can guess what kind of replies he got to that one. A lot of things about salvation having nothing to do with that, salvation is individual, all the things I've just critiqued right there on Twitter. Our understanding of salvation must develop with an awareness of the interconnectedness of both collective sin and collective salvation. It must understand our and God's deep relationship to the earth and all its inhabitants. It must offer critique, lament, and hope. In further chapters of my dissertation, I articulate important contributions to such a soteriology that have been made by somewhat unlikely partners, ecofeminism and patristic deification theology, in which salvation is framed as a union with God. Ultimately, I will argue the goal of all creation is divinization, the broken and crucified body of God, to use Sally McFague's metaphor for the world, restored to new life and invited into the life of the Trinity. Thank you. Look forward to hearing the other papers.
Thank you so much for your fascinating and rich presentation today, which is which makes me think about the fact that salvation is also about health. The root meaning of salvation is also health, especially in this era of pandemic. So our next presenter is LaShaunda Reese. LaShaunda is a third-year PhD student in ethics and theology program in Loyola. Her interests include the intersectionality of narrative ethics and the African-American experience. LaShaunda has been a case manager for persons with severe mental illness and is currently an ethics fellow with Advocate Aurora Health. Her presentation today is titled, "And Yet We Survive: Ethical Reflections on the Double Pandemic of COVID and Racial Brutality in Black America." So, LaShaunda.
Thank you, Keunwoo. Okay, so I am going to start with a poem by Audre Lorde, and then I will proceed into my essay. The title of the poem is A Litany for Survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways, coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So, It is better to speak, remembering that we were never meant to survive. On February 23rd, 2020, Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed jogging through a neighborhood in Georgia. While this was an extremely tragic event, all I could think was, again. Loyola was let out for spring break for the first week of March, and at that time, I believe one case of the novel coronavirus had made its way to the western shores of the United States. We returned to school, and by Thursday, March 12th, Loyola's campus was evacuated for what we assumed would be approximately 14 days. The next day, on Friday, March 13th, Breonna Taylor was murdered in her sleep in Louisville, Kentucky by police who raided the wrong address. This was an extremely troubling incident that once again shook me to my core, yet all I could murmur was, again. We went into a potential lockdown for what seemed to be months, and the possibility of easing restrictions in cities was rocked on May 25th when the world watched Derek Chauvin take the life from George Floyd's body for over a period of 9 minutes and 29 seconds in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Horrified, exhausted, impoverished, and confused, people began to protest. The repeated televised assault and death of Black bodies, coupled with months of social distancing, loss of income, pausing of livelihood and life activities, led to protests that escalated into rioting, looting, assaults, and general dissent. The temperature has risen to summertime, but in no way does it feel like summer. Relishing over the past 5 months, we are once again shocked as Rayshard Brooks is shot and killed in a Wendy's parking lot in Atlanta, Georgia on June 12th. Please remember that this is only a small fraction of the broadcasted shootings. It seemed that the longstanding burden of racial discrimination was publicly reignited with the fuel of a pandemic that followed the trends of many other illnesses, disproportionately impacting communities of color. It would seem that within my 29 years of lifetime, this was the first time where I questioned, how is it we were ever meant to survive such simultaneous catastrophes? Audre Lorde's poem eloquently addresses a point of reference for the disposition of those who, quote, live on the shoreline, or in what Frantz Fanon and Ta-Nehisi Coates points to as the zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an incline stripped bare of every essential from which a genuine and new departure can emerge, the place where one is not recognized as human and therefore never meant to survive as one. I am fascinated with how those who operate in this fringe envision living a good life. How can one imagine a good life when one was never meant to have a life? And external forces time and time again systematically reinforce this notion. How is one to think of justice when injustice is the normative perceived experience? What does it mean to do no harm or understand non-maleficence when those who are supposed to protect and serve intentionally and deliberately deliver such a standard mode of interaction? Coates asks, how do I live free in this Black body? I think it is precisely at this crisis of life's moments, this arid region where an incline is assumed stripped bare of every essential, that spontaneous moments of opportunity to live and survive emerge. That novel tactics, what Michel de Certeau defines as calculated actions determined by the absence of a proper locus, where the space of the tactic is the space of the other. Within everyday movements of existence, sprout possibilities both envisioned and unimagined, redefining and transforming possibilities of being human. I hope by the end of this, there are questions and thoughts that arise regarding the relevance of what seems to be a repeated monologue. What is the significance about being African-American in the United States? If slavery was legally abolished in 1865/1866, why is there such a need to illuminate the presence and difference of race in 2021? Did not the elections of 2008, 2012, and 2020 visibly prove racism has decreased or diminished? Why does this matter? I contend that the constant degradation and belittling that ethicist Hilla Hawker phrases within misrecognition experienced by Blacks and African Americans and Indigenous peoples, coupled with contemporary conundrums such as COVID, have conditioned groups of people to operate on the fringes of recognized existence, to be within the zone of non-being, and that the continued presence of African Americans and Indigenous peoples inside these spaces represents a unique critique to humanity and traditional heteronormative ways of being. As Audre Lorde rightfully says, we were never meant to survive. The case of Derek Chauvin has been underway for some time. This is chronological, so this is sped forward to this year. The case of Derek Chauvin has been underway for some time. On March 29th, 13-year-old Adam Toledo and April 11th, Dante Wright were both shot and killed by police in Chicago, Illinois, and Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, respectively. Let me be clear, when we are speaking of survival, it is not in the sense limited to a narrow understanding of clinging on to life after a traumatic accident or almost becoming the victim of a malicious event. Quite the contrary. Survival must also be viewed as matriculating through the academic system, as becoming a property owner or a top-tier professional, or simply living as one's old Black self in one's own neighborhood until one is old and gray. It is not so much the outcome, but rather the process and conditions that are set up in favor of some and in neglect of others that I'm shining a light upon. When those deemed unlikely and unfavorable not only acknowledge their own, but use their own existence and expand upon a space to create community, to break through the narrow view of humanity unknown to many others, to access the joy embedded in hope and spread it to those around oneself, to refuel, to rest, to restart, to construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct the self, all within those fringes and shorelines. This is an ethics of survival. Unlike a large proportion of environmental waste, pollution, loss of jobs, poverty, and crime, the coronavirus left no personal stone unturned, completely flipping societies around the world on their heads. But what can be said about the United States? That despite the universality of the pandemic, the most impacted areas and groups of people mimic the longstanding disparities highlighted time and time again. Yes, everyone had to immediately adjust to what it meant to socially distance, which by now the term has negative connotations and the phrase physically distant is more apt. Communities of color and Black and brown bodies have experienced extreme manifestations of dis-ease, discomfort, and discontent. An experience that mimics those of post-Reconstruction, the Great Depression, the drug epidemic in the 80s, the recession in 2008, and now COVID in 2020. Now, there's an incredible article outlining the parallels of the COVID pandemic and the rise in internationally based racial discrimination. And that broadly focuses on the discrimination and injustice experienced by Asians, Asian Americans, and people of color globally, which I think is a highly important point to elicit. But my focus is locally, viscerally, the context that we feel, live, breathe, and can no longer escape. What does this all mean? Perhaps it means for those who are not used to a traumatic loss of resources, COVID was a shock unlike any other. However, for those in detrimental situations prior to, COVID actually opened up more spontaneous opportunities for survival. Within this arid region of existence where colonial and patriarchal norms add no value to the life of the marginalized, African Americans and people of color have developed an ability to hope amid despair, to flourish amid death. That perhaps through repeated exposure to lack of resources, respect, and recognition, certain groups are more prone to be creative and struggle through survival than others because it has been ingrained into their both personal and collective being. I finished this conclusion on April 20th as the verdict was reached in the Derek Chauvin case. Minutes before that, I was completely unaware that 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant took her last breath as she was shot and killed in Columbus, Ohio, wielding a knife at another individual. Perhaps the country and the world had gotten a grips on COVID with the production and mandating of vaccines, though some deaths continue. But as far as racism, police brutality, and white supremacy resulting in Black deaths, the struggle remains. Continuing to ask for peace, justice, and proper recognition among the violent, unjust, and misrecognized is a constant day-to-day expression of lively being. When expressed by those in day-to-day decisions through generations of non-being existing on the shorelines, when those instances of spontaneity elicit something authentically original, that is how we have survived and will continue to survive. When the external degradations do not overwhelm the internal yearning to be fully recognized as a mutual participant in the divine, that is when you see a new and refreshing expression of life. So, afraid that when I speak, I will not be heard, I speak still, remembering that even up to this day, we were never meant to, and yet we survived. I leave you with a short statement from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Before I could discover, before I could escape, I had to survive, and no one survives unscathed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your powerful and thought-provoking presentation, which makes me think about Judith Butler's distinction between precariousness and precarity. And the fact that you're talking about the ethics of survival, not ethics of good life or even flourishing, is very telling to me. Thank you again. And our next presenter is Dr. John Crowley-Buck. John is Special Assistant to the Vice President for Mission and Ministry and Adjunct Lecturer in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. He is the co-editor of Democracy, Culture, and Catholicism, Voices from Four Continents. John's presentation today is titled, What Ought We to Do? Ethical Reflections Amid Contingency and Crisis. So, John.
Great, thank you, Keunwoo. And thank you to all of my fellow panelists, Kathleen and LaShaunda and Wendy, who we will be hearing from soon. I'm gonna share my screen here with everybody as I have a PowerPoint to accompany my reflection today. And now I just have to adjust so I can see people as you can see me, or at least I hope. All right. So as I always need to ask my students, just to make sure I'm doing everything right, thumbs up, everyone can see the PowerPoint and you can hear me? Awesome, okay. So my remarks today are going to address the question of what ought we to do, ethical reflections amid contingency and crisis. Oh, and I need to click in the PowerPoint. There we go. So just as a quick outline of what I'm going to sort of touch upon in my remarks today. First, I want to sort of set the stage. This actually is going to be very quick, as I think many of us will recognize some of the realities of contingency, of crisis that we are experiencing today. From after that sort of stage setting, I want to move into exploring the question of the ought in ethical reflection, the question of normativity. And here I want to turn to the philosopher Christine Korsgaard as a guide for us as we think about a way of articulating normativity in ethics. Next, in terms of contingency and crisis, the question of context, I want to draw upon the voice and the witness of the Catholic womanist theologian Shawn Copeland in a couple of her pieces, including in Flesh and Freedom, and what Copeland offers in terms of the contextual reality of, in particular, Black female experience. Then I want to turn to the sort of the what do we do now, the action, the question of how do we embody and enact the oughts, right? Question of action. And for that, I want to turn to two people. First, I will turn to Emily Towns for an articulation of a kind of ethics that I think brings into conversation all these different pieces. And then also, in terms of an action, the poet Amanda Gorman, in particular her poem, The Hill We Climb. So to begin, what do contingency and crisis look like today? And today being very, very practical, the now of the now. Certainly we recognize the pandemic, right? The COVID pandemic has in different ways and for different communities raised the challenges of contingency, the challenges of crisis. And certainly, as LaShaunda pointed out, different communities have been affected differently, and that is a reality that impacts the way that we think and speak about this. As Kathleen mentioned, the ecological and environmental crisis that we are in, and the deeply contingent nature of our own sort of existence and being in light of what is potentially down the road for us in terms of the environment and ecology. Without a question, the challenge of racial injustice and police brutality against Black and brown bodies continues to be a reality that we face, as unspeakable and as that is, and this also, I think, is one of our contexts, right, at the moment. And then, of course, you know, the political upheaval that is not disconnected from these other contingent moments by any stretch of the imagination, but the kind of challenge that is being presented in terms of the approaches that we are taking and understandings that we have of the very kind of societies that we are enmeshed in. And so these different sort of realities, I think, frame, or at least I hope, give an insight into framing some of the contingencies, some of the crises we face today. In order to address the question of ethical normativity within all of this, I want to begin with a look at Course Guard and see what it is she might be able to offer us as we try and wrap our minds around doing ethics, right, in this time and place. For those of you who are not familiar with Course Guard, she is a philosopher from Harvard. She has sort of her intellectual genealogy really traces its way back to two primary figures. On the one hand, Aristotle, and on the other hand, Kant. And so she's kind of very much in the vein of these two sort of streams of the intellectual discipline. In terms of her ethics, in terms of her exploration of the question of normativity, she really kind of puts forward a way of thinking about, a way of encountering, a way of living into Kant's categorical imperative, right? Now, this is something that a lot of people immediately hear, and it throws up panic buttons from freshman year philosophy and what in the world is this all about, right? But what I want to try and do is maybe articulate a way of thinking about the categorical imperative through Course Guard's own sort of work that might help us when we think about how normativity impacts us today, or at least how we can use normativity, right? It impacts us in many ways, but how can we engage it in ethical reflection? Excuse me. So to start, where does Course Guard place sort of the ought of normativity, right? What we ought to do. She suggests that there's really two major strands of thought in where we can locate the moral, the ethical ought, right? In the substantive and in the procedural, right? And this is the first point you see on the slide here. So what Course Guard suggests is that the substantive approach, right, to moral normativity claims that there are answers to moral questions, right, because there are moral truths or facts that exist independently of the procedures for arriving at them. Now, as I said, as a Kantian, she will not buy into this particular narrative, right? So the substantive approach is, I think Course Guard says it is in the conversation, but it's not the direction she's going to take. The ought of normativity is not in the substantive. For Course Guard, it comes out in the procedural, right? For her, the procedural locates normativity in procedural terms, right? In the argument that there are answers to moral questions because there are correct procedures for arriving at them, right? So it's not that the ought exists sort of as a thing, right, that we have to sort of reach or get to, but it's in the procedures that we agree upon. It's in the procedures that we come to and that we bring to the question, right? That's where the question of normativity lies. So, of course, as I mentioned, for Course Guard, this sort of procedural approach, right, is principle guided, and it's guided by the categorical imperative, right? And the categorical imperative famously is sort of Kant divides it into three different iterations, right? The formula of universal law, the formula of humanity, and then the formula of autonomy in the kingdom of ends. This first formulation, right, the formula of universal law, is the one that I think is one of the trickiest ones in terms of Kant's reception history in this area. For Course Guard, though, what the formula of universal law really tells us is that what we need in order to approach the question of normativity, in order to engage normatively, right, we have to find a shareable procedural principle, right? And that's very, very important. I think sometimes we think of Kant's categorical imperative as kind of off in its own realm, but not for Course Guard. It actually has to have these qualities of shareability. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about its publicity, right? And this is important. So the categorical imperative must be shareable, right? It is a principle-guided approach to normativity. But it doesn't just do that, says Korsgaard, right? It's not simply about identifying formal procedures, right? It is also about content and, for lack of a better term, framing, right? So what is the content of this normative procedure that Korsgaard wants to offer us? She identifies it as the dignity of humanity. And this is, she takes, of course, again, from Kant. So what is the content? The dignity of humanity. Why? Because it embodies for Korsgaard Kant's notion of what is rational. And here I do want to give a little bit of a definition, because I think when we hear this, or at least I used to, sort of shut down, right? What are we talking about? Here's what Korsgaard means when she talks about rationality as that which grounds the dignity of humanity, right? In terms of this normative procedure. Rationality, the constitutive dimension of humanity, which allows it to not only set ends for itself and the means to those ends, but also to take reflective distance from the means and ends available to choose which means and which ends to pursue in line with one's practical identity, right? And what she's suggesting here is that our rationality is manifest in that we are value-conferring creatures. We are creatures who choose our ends and can also reflect upon what ends we choose, right? And this is something that she will come out a little bit later. But this is why the content for her, right? This is a unique capacity for humanity, which is why this constitutes the dignity of the humanity that sort of grounds the ethically normative procedure that we see in the first formulation, the formula of universal law. So the dignity of humanity is constituted by our rationality, so understood, right? Understood as Korsgaard is naming it. And this is what makes the dignity of humanity sort of the immutable content of normative reflection, right? However, lest we slide into a form of sort of hyper-individualism that I think frequently haunts any Kantian analysis, we must recognize, as Korsgaard does, that while the autonomous individual is central to the analysis, dignity lies not in one individual human person, right, but in humanity, right? So we are required to move beyond the isolated individual and into humanity's inescapably social matrix, right? And this is where we come to the third formulation in the autonomy in the kingdom of ends. Right. Now, of course, kingdom, what she really means here is something like what John Henry Newman used to mean by science, right? The systematic union of various rational beings through common laws. If the common laws for Korsgaard, as for Kant, of course, are the moral agents themselves. But so this is what the kingdom of ends, right, looks like. And the question of normativity, argues Korsgaard, cannot be answered in isolated individualism, but only when it is enmeshed in the matrix of our essentially social human constitution. As I said, her two sort of great thinkers are Kant and Aristotle. And here I think we can very much see the Zoon Politikon, right? The human person is the social creature, right? Korsgaard thinks that Kant is aware of this and that it is part of the formulation here. The kingdom of ends itself, as Korsgaard describes it, is constituted by reciprocity, by responsibility, by respect. It emphasizes publicity and shareability, right? Publicity and shareability of not only reasons, but rationality itself. It's the space of deliberation and reflective distance, right? This is all of what takes place sort of in this ideal of the kingdom of ends. So we have to ask ourselves, in the context of contingency and crisis, and certainly what Korsgaard has offered so far sort of isn't impacted by that yet. How do we engage, share, and deliberate and reflect normatively in these contexts of contingency and crisis? So for an insight into this dimension of the question, I'd like to turn to the theologian and ethicist and womanist thinker, Shawn Copeland. So for Copeland, she names in a very upfront way what she takes our context to be, right? And for Copeland, the context, our human context, is that of suffering. right? So she says in her piece, Wading Through Many Sorrows, suffering is universal, an inescapable fact of the human condition. It defies immunities of all kinds. Suffering despoils women and men, irrespective of race or tongue, wealth or poverty, learning or virtue, disregards merit or demerit, reward or punishment, honor or corruption. Like sun and rain, suffering comes unbidden to the just and the unjust alike. So what does she mean by suffering here? Because it is a very loaded concept with, certainly as we've already seen today, different iterations in different communities. For Copeland, suffering is the disturbance of our inner tranquility caused by physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual forces that we grasp as jeopardizing our lives and our very existence. All right. Now, while this naming of our context, right, does reflect a certain universal quality to it, right, if suffering is what we experience, it is in the encounter with particularity that this context is more clearly spelled out, right? For Copeland, the particularity that illuminates the universal is the particularity of the Black female body. Now, this is not about, says Copeland, glorifying suffering, and nor is this about essentializing identity, right? The focus on the particularity of Black female experience in her work is epistemological, right? If we can, as she says, if we can uncover the imago Dei, right, in the embodied experience of particularly Black women, then we can find and uncover the imago Dei anywhere, right? If we can find it here, this is the test case, because the triple oppression that is experienced by Black women sort of is what challenges us, right? If we can find the imago Dei here, then we can connect. And rather than glorifying suffering, Copeland interrogates this, the experience of suffering, which again, she says is unavoidable, in order to see what emerges from the voices and experience of those who suffer, right? And so what does emerge for Copeland when we interrogate this category of suffering? There are sort of three things that she identifies. First, what she tells us is the voices of Black women reveal, right, first the importance of memory and remembering, right? And so Copeland in her work goes into quite frequently slave narratives, for example, her famous retelling of Harriet Jacobs or Linda Brent and her narrative, but also into the spirituals from the African-American religious tradition, right? That these are acts of memory and remembering that the voices of Black women are communicating, are sharing with us, right? So the importance of remembering is central. Second, the practice of resistance, right? She specifically turns to what she calls the dangerous memory, right? Which is certainly a concept that has been taken up in other areas, but she refers to this dangerous memory that emerges from the encounter of Black women with the biblical witness. They read stories, they hear stories that challenge them, right? That encourage them to think of themselves in ways that are other than the way that the sort of dominant master narrative wants them to think of themselves. So this dangerous memory of freedom comes out in resistance, as well as in language, right? These categories that Copeland talks about sass and gossip, right? That these are categories that we think of as, oh no, those are things we shouldn't do. And yet what Copeland suggests is that in its form of resistance, right? Sass and gossip are the ways in which communication happens outside the control of the master narrative, right? That it's through talking back, it's through talking off in the corner. That's where truth is revealed, right? That is where stories are told that aren't required to sort of meet the standards of the master narrative. So then there is also the act of redemption. This is also the Black female body as redeeming, right? And here she talks about how Black female embodiment sort of redefines Christianity. And I couldn't help but think of a recent piece in the Washington Post that I read by the historian Shannon D. Williams at Villanova, who talks about a remembering of sorts of Black experience in the United States. You know, as a fan of Is It As I Am, the 1619 Project gives us a particular narrative, but what Williams suggests is that actually Black female experience, and in particular Black female Catholic experience, dates back to the 1560s, right? When slaves were brought to then Spanish-controlled Florida, right? St. Augustine, Florida. And that this narrative, in a way, we have to reimagine the Catholic and Christian experience in America through the lens, through the embodiment of Black women, because they've been here since the beginning, right? Apologies, just gonna sort this. Okay, so I just saw, Keunwoo, your comment. That's what I was looking at. So let me go ahead and wrap this up a little bit. So what does Copeland's argument, what do the voices and the witnesses of these women reveal to us about the question of normativity and ethics? First, it's about embodiment, right? And in particular, the struggle for authenticity, right? This is what Copeland wants us to take away. And this is all in the face of confronting what is what she calls the lie, right? The lie of slavery, the lie of everything that emerges from slavery, from Reconstruction through Jim Crow up into what we experience today through the war on drugs, mass incarceration. And it's this lie that we have to confront, right? And in order to do that, I want to take one last turn to our two final figures, which is Emily Towns and Amanda Gorman. I was going to take a quick pause and say, I've gone through this very quickly. So if you're a little confused, you're not alone. My little reference to The Good Place here. But turning to Towns in particular. So what Towns offers us in contextualizing and naming her work in the womanist tradition, she takes she's in conversation with Copeland, right? And she does not reject, right, the universal, right? Towns isn't rejecting universal in the way that neither is Copeland. But what she is doing is she's calling us to recognize that our universals are actually contextual. They are not disembodied truths of nature and being, right? In the same way that Korsgaard rejects the substantive approach, Towns is subjecting this kind of disembodied universalism. But our universals are located, communal and contextual. And in recognizing the need to navigate these spaces between the universal and the particular, Town names the ethical task for us, right, as a form of art, right? That there's an art to the ethical reflection. More so than a science, though she's not, of course, rejecting that. Ethics requires flexibility and recognition of particularity between public and shareable approaches in recognition of universality. Normativity becomes the procedure that guides this work, right? And for Towns, the art of ethics, the question of normativity, the question of the ought are, in the final analysis, about justice, and specifically justice as truth-telling. So this idea, the justice as truth-telling, is precisely what the dominant narrative, right, what she calls the fantastic hegemonic imagination, does not want us to do, right? It does not want anyone to do. The lie that undergirds the operations of the sort of hegemonic powers that be cannot handle truth-telling. It interrupts, it disrupts the process. And so this is precisely why it tries to marginalize the voices of those who give rise to the injustices, right? Who name the violence. The fantastic hegemonic imagination, as she says, conceived, raised, and nurtured this lie. It relied on as it entrenched its numbing and anesthetizing qualities, right? So it's only fitting. The truth-telling is what breaks it apart. The truth-telling is what interrupts. She says to combine challenge with hope, which is what justice as truth-telling does for us. To combine challenge with hope is powerful, for together they enable us to press onward when we are at the verge of giving up, to draw strength from the future, to live in a discouraging present. Challenge and hope make it possible for us to see the world, not only as it is, but also as it can be, so that it can move us to new places and turn us into a new people. So justice as truth-telling, according to Towns, is normative. It is what we ought to do. Right? So what does that look like today? I would go ahead and end my thoughts here, my remarks, by reading you a few stanzas of a poem from Amanda Gorman, as I mentioned, and I'll go ahead and wrap up my remarks with this. So here's what Amanda Gorman tells us about justice, what I think about justice as truth-telling in the face of the fantastic hegemonic imagination and as an example of the procedure, right, of normativity in ethics today. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it. Because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. So apologies that I went a little over time there, just sharing with you my sort of works cited here, but thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, John, for your rich and sophisticated presentation today. So our fourth and last presenter is Dr. Wendy Crosby. So Wendy is an assistant professor of religious studies and program coordinator for the religious studies department at Siena Heights University. Her presentation today is titled Shared Wounds of Crisis, Communal Openings of Beauty. So Wendy.
Thank you. I'll get right to it. Jean-Louis Chrétien was a prominent Catholic French phenomenologist who passed away a little less than a year before our pandemic concerns began, which is how we measure time now, I think. He frequently uses the story of Jacob wrestling God to describe the anguish and wound of hearing the call. In this story, a man, God or an angel, battles Jacob for reasons. Come dawn, Jacob is winning, but the angel makes a final blow to his hip, dislocating it. Now with the upper hand, the angel suggests they end the fight, but Jacob insists on a blessing. Here and at the end of the story, we get the sense that Jacob already knows who this man really is. The ending is as opaque as the start, but Jacob receives a new name, Israel, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, a reward for his willingness to persevere against humans and God alike. But the angel doesn't heal his limp. He is wounded. We are also wounded. I'm going to suggest that we might use this story of Jacob to understand our own wounds today and how they might open us up to hear a call and respond to the crisis of the present moment, using the pathway Chrétien articulates from wound to call to beautiful things. Chrétien suggests a process that takes us from opening a wound to hearing a call and finally to producing beautiful things. To hear a call, whether from God or another human person, always requires a prior wound, which opens us up to something outside of ourselves. Once we have heard a call, we find beauty in ourselves and respond by producing beautiful things. We can unpack each of these steps in relation to Jacob and our situation of crisis today. Wounds. To begin, I want to note what I see as two important differences between our wounds and Jacob's. First, the world is wounded today. This moment of crisis is characterized by the communal nature of our wounds. While Jacob's call sets him and his family apart, even from his brother Esau, none of us can respond alone to the crises that come to us in the form of climate change or systemic racism. So in this moment of crisis, we must ask how we can hear and respond together. Second, in a world wounded by COVID-19, police brutality, sexual assaults, transphobia, and so on, many people are limping, and some are suffocating. Some wounds prove fatal. The recognition of the fatality of wounds heightens this moment of crisis. I wonder if during the wrestling match, Jacob worried for his survival. In this moment of crisis, we certainly do, and some of us more than others. Nevertheless, Chrétien's reading of this story still has value for us because he opens up the possibility of responding out of our woundedness. For Chrétien, the wound signifies an opening which allows us to hear a call. A call comes from outside of ourselves. A call asks us to hear something or think something different from what we've heard or thought before. That requires vulnerability. For Jacob, it means he won't really be able to hear his call to be Israel until his hip gets dislocated. A call always involves a wound. Chrétien's use of the word wounding evades connotation as simply good or bad. To be wounded is to suffer, but it also invites a response which can be beautiful. So there's a tension there that needs to be worked out. The wound is like the vulnerability that opens up the possibility of intimacy. Risky, but tantalizing. Or perhaps it's like the recognition, when the recognition of a problem opens up the possibility of asking for help. Terrifying, but also a relief. It might be like re-engaging in normal social interactions after a year of Zoom hangouts. Awkward and desperate, but joyful. I assume Michigan's not there yet. Sometimes, though, we know the wounds look like our societies choosing profits over people, choosing guns over tasers, or choosing conspiracy over democracy. Calls. Chrétien writes that tokalun, that which calls, produces takala, beautiful things. It's a pun in Greek, although it doesn't work in English, but the line is important because it offers insight into what kind of calls might enter our open wounds. They are calls to beauty and transformation. Chrétien writes, in every manifestation of God, direct or indirect, there is adventure and advent. God comes to me, God happens to me, and I am affected by God's arrival. To speak of this beauty is to speak to it also, to respond to it and become responsible for it, just as it means becoming responsible for my own transfiguration at its hands, and thus being responsible for myself more than is really possible, for it is not I who have transformed myself in this way. The transformation that Chrétien describes consists of discovering beauty within oneself. The discovery of our own beauty is both transformative and surprising, and it empowers us to produce beautiful things. The call is what compels us to bring peace, joy, forgiveness, hospitality, justice into the world. Perfections that most Christians would simply call God. For Chrétien, whatever there is of God in the created world comes from our response to God's call, making humanity both responsible and creative. Jacob's wound is personal, but wounds of societal crisis can also carry the transformative aspect Chrétien describes. Referring to the crisis of climate change, Pope Francis mentions in his most recent TED Talk from October 2020 that, quote, "From this crisis, none of us must come out the same. We cannot come out the same. From a crisis, we never come out the same," end quote. His statement comes off as both a fact and a plea. Crisis changes us, but also we must let it change us if we are to survive. Later in the same talk, he notes that love is interpersonal, but love is also political. A crisis like climate change calls for a political response. A political response not only calls us to wrestle with individuals, but also to dismantle harmful structures and habits of our society. In the context of crisis, Pope Francis rightly points us to a communal understanding of our wound and a communal understanding of the transformative call we all can be opened up to hear. Beautiful things. If God is beauty itself, and our responses to God's calls are only partial reflections, wouldn't the transformative discovery of beauty in ourselves still look ugly in comparison? Recognizing this problem, Chrétien takes us in a different direction. He describes God as the source of beauty, but not necessarily as beauty itself. Rather, beauty is a gift given to us, a grace. By making God the source of beauty, rather than making beauty a divine name, Chrétien creates a space for the beauty we create to be truly beautiful. The beauty we create is not a pale reflection, but an excess we find in ourselves. It was always already there, but when we find it, it seems new. Quoting Augustine, Chrétien notes that "late have I loved you" always describes our encounter with the beauty we find and love in ourselves. When we find this excess of beauty in ourselves, a gift from God, but not a mere reflection of God, it is beauty in its fullness and it empowers us. Consequently, the call produces beautiful things through our participation. Few illustrate this better than Emmanuel Garibai. Garibai is a contemporary painter from the Philippines whose work touches on colonialism, politics, social justice, and religion. He notes that Filipinos are seen as outsiders, not quite Western and not quite Asian, and tries to share that experience through his art. When drawing on biblical narratives, his paintings never merely illustrate the story. They tell their own narrative, often challenging the viewer to become uncomfortable in what was once a familiar story. His painting Mendiola, painted in 2010, is one such example. The title refers to Mendiola Street in Manila, which is near the official residence for the President of the Philippines, and consequently is also the site of frequent protests and demonstrations. But Garibai says he also calls this painting Jacob Wrestling with God. Reflecting on this alternative title, Garibai writes, "If you actually try to think about the implication of a mere mortal wrestling with God and prevailing, it's a very radical idea. I was brought up in a very kind of traditional, conservative, pious way of looking at God. And then suddenly you encounter a text that says Jacob wrestles with God. As I reflect on it, I see wrestling with God as actually wrestling with life. And the more you wrestle with life, each time you prevail, the closer you are to God, because you gain a deeper understanding of life. So the image here is that of protesters trying to fight off police authorities. Sorry. In this case, these police authorities are trying to evict them from the place where they are staying because they are squatters. Garibai draws our attention to the communal wounds of those facing societal injustices and reminds us that our wounds, like Jacob's, are often literal and physical. It is interesting to me that Garibai's ultimate measure of success or of winning the wrestling match is gaining a deeper understanding of life. I think that this is in line with Chrétien had in mind as well. These protesters have seen something within themselves that is worth defending. It is unclear whether or not their protest will do any good, but it is beautiful. It is beautiful when those who have been disregarded regard themselves as beautiful and producers of beautiful things. The transformative discovery of these protesters and their own human dignity, worth, and beauty, I'm sure felt as if it came too late. Late have I loved you. And yet they are now responding and taking responsibility for that transformation through a communal act of civil disobedience. I am especially drawn to the protester in the corner who looks out to the viewer as if to ask whether we too are willing to be a part of this communal response. Do we too have an open wound? What might it look like to respond communally or to produce beautiful things together? To hear a communal call means to share a wound. Not just individuals, but our societies and cultures and environments are limping. We can take one final lesson from Jacob's story. Although Jacob is an individual who wrestled as an individual and limped as an individual, the point of the story is that he becomes a community, Israel. And Israel as a community finds a way to share the wound of Jacob's limp. The story ends, quote, "That is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle," end quote. Israel has taken on Jacob's wound as a shared wound and has produced a communal response that is beautiful in its attention to the ways they continue to wrestle with God and humanity. Let us hope that the wounds of humanity and all of creation reveal the excess of beauty within us soon. For the only transformation that can save us is a shared one in which we become the very beauty that we need. Thank you.
Thank you for your very beautiful presentation, Wendy. It's beautiful in both forms and contents. So I got a question from Dr. Teresa Calpino here. This is a question for John. With all the emphasis on rationality, where does the intuitive fit in? If we reify rationality, is irrationality / intuitive dangerous? Do we categorize some as, quote, irrational? So this is directed to John. So I guess John would have to say something to this question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Keunwoo. And thank you, Dr. Calpino. So the question of the intuitive vis-a-vis that of the rational, I think is what I understand the question to be. The reason for my emphasis on the rationality component is that it is part of what Korsgaard identifies as the constitutive feature of what of the dignity of humanity, right? Now, intuition is, I don't think that we do away with intuition, but in terms of what CourseGuard is trying to do, it is, our rational capacity is that by which we can take reflective distance from our choices and actions, right? And so intuition for her doesn't quite meet the standard because it doesn't have quite the robustness that rationality does in order to address the question in terms of normativity. That isn't to say that our intuitions are irrelevant by any stretch of the imagination, right? We certainly are creatures that desire, right? And these desires sort of bring us to that moment where we have to identify our ends and our means and choose our ends and then reflect on them. So I think intuition is a part of it, but it just in terms of what it means for CourseGuard's analysis to sort of ground normativity, it's in that sort of procedure rather than in something that for her it comes in at a different stage of the process. I hope that addresses that gets at the question.
All right, so if you have any questions, please send your questions directly to me through chat. And I'd like to give our presenters to make some comments to each other's works, presentations, and thoughts. So today, Kathleen talked about ecological crisis in relation to Christian doctrine of salvation. And LaShaunda talked about racial injustices in the United States in relation to also COVID-19 situation. And also John talked about normativity, contingency, and what we have to do, what we ought to do in this crisis. And also Wendy talked about the necessity of beauty in this crisis, and also we can perhaps glimpse some beauty through these wounds. So maybe you would have something to talk about each other's work. So if anyone here has something to comment, make some comment, yeah.
Yeah, I could comment. Just to add, this wasn't in my paper, but JCB brought up this idea that if you could see the Imago Dei in a Black woman, you could see it anywhere, something along those lines from Sean Copeland. And Chrétien makes an interesting observation when he's talking about this discovery of beauty in ourselves, that when people paint images of Christ, they're often sort of like self-portraits in a sense, right? And it's not that we think that that's what Jesus really looked like or something, obviously, but it's a manifestation of this surprise of seeing this divine excess in ourselves, seeing that we actually are Christ-like ourselves, and that sort of being put on the paper. And so yeah, so I just thought that was a connection you could sort of make in recognizing yourself as Christ-like.
Thank you. Any comments, John?
Oh yeah, I was actually, thanks, Wendy. I think that's really a good connection. I was actually just going to say for LaShaunda, you know, I was so taken in your remarks when you named, and of course I heard this and I thought, when you named injustice as the normative, right? That is what is the normative reality, and it is, you know, and I was thinking in terms of, you know, well, what am I trying to say here? It is that the normative procedure can bring about this justice as truth-telling that Towns wants to see. But I just want to say that I think that you remind me yet again that this language is, and this framework is sort of constantly needs to be in dialogue, right? And that what do we do with this question of the ought, this question of normativity, when we start from injustice, right? When we start from the place of injustice, like someone like Judith Shklar, of course, talks about this quite a lot. And when you mentioned and misrecognition that comes in. So I just wanted to say that I've been thinking about that since you said it. It's a really thoughtful and interesting and insightful and critical piece for sort of my own larger project. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I wanted to see where I could go when epistemology is at the source of like human interaction and human understanding. And so if our whole understanding of how we come to know what it means to be human is through negative interaction and negative connotations, well, then one, we could either continue to reinscribe those, right? Or we can do something different in that difference, in that moment of spontaneity. It looks like many different things, authentically speaking, right? And so, and that's from a plethora of contexts, not just African-American peoples, you know, people who are categorized as disabled, or people who, immigrants even, right? Just even trying to navigate spaces that are not set up for their existence or success, and how they do that and how those ways help one confront traditional understandings or normative structures that do not allow for varieties of life expressions. And two, it redefines and helps give a more vibrant understanding of humanity. I really think so. So thank you for that.
So one of the things I found, one of the things I kept thinking while I was listening to Kathleen's and LaShaunda's presentation today was the notion of environmental racism or environmental injustice, which tells us that even though we are all vulnerable to ecological disaster, some people are very disproportionately hit by this disaster because of this inequality in this world. So some people even say that Anthropocene is a hoax and we should call it capitalocene or racial capitalocene or something like that. So I wonder if Kathleen or LaShaunda have something to tell about this intersection between, you know, race and ecology, or, you know, poverty and ecology. Yeah.
I'm happy to cede to LaShaunda if she has anything immediate, but not seeing your microphone turning off, LaShaunda. So I'll start. I guess, yeah. So in my larger project, I think a lot about the overlapping and intersectional ways that hierarchies and oppressions are structured, and this is definitely one of them. Thinking about persons who live in lower-lying coastal areas and persons who are very dependent upon agriculture that is at risk, that is particularly at risk. Within the United States, environmental racism often looks like putting coal plants and other things in places, and other like things that, you know, we don't want that in this neighborhood, we're going to put it in this neighborhood. Highways, destruction of communities, pollution, all sorts of things being located where Black communities are, where Indigenous and otherwise disadvantaged communities are. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just on a factual level, but what do we do with that? The fact that the systems of oppression are so interwoven means that the solution also needs to be interwoven. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually talks about that a lot in its report. It links them to Sustainable Development Goals and the eradication of poverty. So in a way, this climate change report has a preferential option for the poor and marginalized. Just as Pope Francis wants an integral ecology, there's a growing understanding that all of these things need to go together. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but that's just a beginning. Thank you.
So that was great, Kathleen. Thank you. And I'm glad you went first. Thanks. So from focusing on a race standpoint, I think it's very important to know that, you know, the environment and the external factors play a heavy, heavy role in the composition of inter-identity groups, right? So in other words, among Black and Brown communities, based upon where things are situated, based upon where resources are divvied, it has a direct impact onto the value of life for that particular area, which then further can divide groups of people who may have been categorized wholly based upon race or skin color, now actually divide themselves based upon access to resources, healthcare. You know, like we think about the Flint, the Flint River crisis and the water crisis, and thinking about how socioeconomically speaking, there was no value seen there in the people or the environment. And so they felt it was okay to detrimentally impact both, right? You impact the water, it impacts the people. You impact the people, it impacts the water. And so I think not only does there need to be a reestablished value and kind of a giving way to the environment and to how we are so interdependent, but also how that interdependency can have a refreshing outlook on human life and how we are interconnected and how we have direct impact on one another. So I definitely think there's a lot that can be said there, but they're heavily related and interconnected, definitely.
Thank you so much, Kathleen and LaShaunda. So I got a question from our Hilly Haka. I'm gonna copy and paste this to you and so that everyone can see. I think this is for John. Is the zone of non-being the negative source of normatively for the ethics of survival, not as the kingdom of ends, but as the dark side of history and society, the zone where life is not? What is the implication of this negative universalism? I cannot really represent what our Hilly Haka wants to say, but John, any comments, response? Yeah, source of normativity, yes.
Yes, I'm just going to read the question one more time to make sure I get it.
Mm-hmm. For your information, our session will end 4:15 today.
So this is a really interesting question, and one that I have to say, it's, as I said to LaShaunda, you know, the categories that when you were speaking, this idea of, you know, the unjust as the normative, the idea of the zone of non-being that comes from Frantz Fanon, that comes from Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm not sure I have a really good answer to this. I guess I need a little more clarity on exactly what the question is. Sorry, I think I'm missing something.
Maybe Hilly, do you want to say something about your own question? Would it be possible for you?
Here we are.
Hello. Good to see you.
Hi, sorry for keeping you here. It was actually more directly to LaShaunda to actually insert the normativity as you understood it with the kingdom of ends, John, and with the concept of dignity. But what happens when we turn it around and start with a kind of a negative universalism, or start with a zone of non-being rather than the kingdom of end? And I just kind of juxtaposed the kingdom of end with, I could have said hell, but I said dark side of history or dark side of society, and it also concerns the environmental sites where life is not. That is the formulation I chose. But the question was more directly to LaShaunda. What does your concept of normativity perhaps contribute to the ethics of survival? That was my question.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Doc. So I think when you start to put the zone of non-being in a conversation with a universalism of any type, you start to come up with statements like, how can I express life in a way so as to not remain in this state of non-being, so as to not reinforce what has identified me as subhuman? And so I think what happens is the zone of non-being, even though it's negative, because if we're comparing being and non-being, it's negative, but it's destabilizing. And so the moment even it becomes normative, even the understanding of what is normative can change at any moment of time, or can be, I use the term spontaneous. And the negative impact on that is that it's spontaneous in a way that does not allow it to remain in the state it was in before that expression. And so I would say that it gives way to something that is unique and that is full of criticism and full of critique, but also full of an alternate expression of life. And it's in doing that, it combats that zone of non-being. And so it's acting in a way that does not keep oneself static in the zone. That's what I would say. Don't be static in the zone of non-being. It keeps a certain level of dynamism.
Any follow-up questions? If there's none, maybe we should end our session. I really appreciate all of your presentations today. I personally, I teach Theo 100 course, and I talked about apocalypse today with my students. And the interesting thing about apocalypse is that it is less about the end of the world than about revealing or unveiling something. So I think this contemporary crisis we're facing has revealed something to us. So making visible things to us, maybe our theological and ethical reflection should start from there. And by doing so, maybe we can even produce something beautiful, as Wendy said. And thank you again for everyone. Yeah, I'm gonna turn this to Megan.
Thank you so much, Keunwoo, and thank you to our final panel, Kathleen, John, LaShaunda, and Wendy. Thank you so much. I just want to say thanks so much for joining us. I had a wonderful time today. I hope that others did too, and especially for hanging in here with us a little bit after time. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much,
you.
Megan.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
It was really good to see you all. Thank you.
You too.